Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Pivot on Hilaal TV. With me, a very special guest, Shazeea Mohammed Ali, who is a geriatrician in Melbourne, Australia. Originally from Malaysia, she has made Australia home for the last 12 years. In addition to practicing as a doctor, she is a researcher in bioethics and has a particular interest in healthcare and ethics. She is also a mum to 2 young kids and comes from a family of community work and political activism. Now, Shazeea is a very interesting character, and I really appreciate the time that she has taken to be here with us today, simply because the time difference is so huge. And as many of us in South Africa will be preparing to sleep at this time, Shaz has actually afforded me some time to do this interview with her, besides being very busy as a medical doctor. So thank you very much, Shazeea, for making this time today.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you for having me. You know, it was wonderful to meet you, Quraisha, so you can't say no to someone like you.
Jazakallah khair. So I'm curious, Shazeea, it's Rabiul Awwal now, and you know, Rabiul Awwal, people celebrate it the world over as a remembrance of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We both met at a summit that was the Prophetic summit that focused on the strategy of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So certainly it was about engaging about the way in which the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam impacts our lives and affects decision making in all spheres of our lives. So very briefly, how has he impacted on your life, and especially in terms of medicine and the choices that you have made?
You know, I was thinking about this question, and the story that came to my mind was the Battle of Uhud, when the Prophet ﷺ himself was injured. You know, I think it was his teeth were knocked out, and some of his companions, I think it was Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, you know, had to protect him with his own body. And you think about, you know, let's not talk about the world leaders of today, but you kind of watch movies where there's battle scenes and you kind of see the king and he's on the horse and he's leading people into battle, but then when the battle actually happens, you know, they go off to the back and they're kind of sheltered. And so that story of the Prophet being willing to put his own life on the line when it came to a really important battle, which, you know, a lot of our scholars say that battle was lost and the war was eventually won. And that to me is a great example of leadership, that there are going to be times when whoever it is that's the leader needs to be right in the front. And we should never think that there is a job that's too small for us. And just relating it, you know, to my everyday work, you know, when I was a junior doctor, so sort of starting out in my career, if I was the only person that was there to give a patient a cup of water, you know, it's water at the end of the day, to make them a cup of tea, to put their blanket on properly, you know, that was something that I accepted. This is me. This is what I have to do. If I'm going to be a leader as a doctor, I have to be able to do these small tasks. And what are these tasks? I'm not being asked to do something huge that's going to take me out of the way. And it's something that I practice with my own team as well. So right now I lead teams of junior doctors and they do what I tell them. I delegate tasks to them. But there are going to be times when they are sick and we're down staff, you know, we're down our team members. And sometimes that means that I have to do the things that I was doing 5 years ago. But, you know, my Prophet did that. My Prophet put himself on the line. By no means is my life on the line, you know, anywhere here. But it's just a reminder that no job is too small. We all have, in all our works, we all have this goal at the end of the day. And sometimes your own steps towards the goal are very big, you know, very ambitious, the sort of things that a leader would be. And sometimes your steps towards the goal is giving someone a cup of water.
Before we get into your actual activism through the medical field, something terrible happened yesterday, and that was in Lebanon, where we see that the pages exploded. And the story that's coming out today is that it's affected mostly healthcare workers, because it's doctors, nurses, healthcare staff who really carry pages today, you know, because you're on call, etc. How did the story affect you? And considering that you're a healthcare worker yourself and that your life too could be in danger, and do you think that this is going to change a lot of things in terms of which, in terms of how healthcare workers are now going to reassess, you know, the technologies that they're holding in their hands?
Look, I don't know if it's going to change the way we think about technology and how that works in a hospital. that's probably a conversation that needs a little bit more sitting down. But we've seen time and time again that unfortunately the Zionist entity, that there are no red lines for them. People talked about the Al-Ahli bombing, it was the first hospital that was bombed, but they bombed healthcare centers in previous wars. If you've been following the conflict for a long time, you know that there are no red lines. You know that healthcare workers are targets. There's no such thing as international humanitarian law. So it's not surprising. Is it shocking? I guess it is. It's so blatant. You kind of hear of this tit for tat that keeps happening, and you and I don't believe that country wants, its leadership wants peace, so we're not surprised in that sense. So I guess it wouldn't change how I felt as a healthcare worker, because if I was a healthcare worker in the West Bank or in Gaza, I would be targeted as well. So what more is there in Lebanon? Why should healthcare workers in Lebanon think that they are any different to healthcare workers in the rest of Palestine?
Now, as a healthcare worker in Australia, I'm sure, and a Muslim, and an activist, and somebody who has a very strong voice, you're very obviously conscious-minded. Your focus has been largely on ethics, looking at the way in which you approach medical healthcare. So it plays a very central part in the way in which you engage and in the way in which you interact. How do you then consider the Australian leadership and their responsibility in terms of ethically standing up and speaking out against the way in which, healthcare workers, innocents, civilians, etc., have been targeted in Palestine, in Gaza? And more importantly, what is your role? Because people the world over are asking the question, what can we do? So as a healthcare worker, what can, in another country, not anywhere near Palestine, far away, thousands of miles, what can you do to contribute towards the freedom of the Palestinian people, freedom from occupation, but also at the same time being a conscious voice, an ethical voice in the country in which you live, to say that, we need to mobilize to make our countries and our leadership aware that this needs to stop and they cannot support it?
So the first thing I'd say to that is our leadership are morally bankrupt. So our current government, our actual prime minister, there's a speech of him in parliament from a few years ago where he is completely criticizing Israel. I think it was one of the wars in the 2010s or so. And he is now, saying what all of these countries are saying, human rights, but blah, 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 let's not even go there. The ruling party committed in its national conference a few years ago to recognize the state of Palestine. They have, now that they are in power, they have refused to do so. They have also blocked motions in parliament to recognize the state of Palestine. So, they said one thing when they were in opposition, and now that they are in power, we cannot hold them to their word. And it's just a reminder, unfortunately, that the kind of politics that's being practiced today is not one where we can hold our elected representatives accountable for many things, Palestine's just being one of them. And so our role, we have been trying to obviously lobby the Department of Health at various sort of federal and state levels, our medical colleges who came out in support of Ukraine during the Ukraine war, and trying to highlight the hypocrisy in doing so. It's been a very long road, and there have been some inroads in some of these, especially the medical colleges, but it's still a very long way until they start behaving in a way that we would deem acceptable. And I think that the focus here now is on talking to our colleagues. So, I remember a conversation with a colleague of mine, I think it was in November or December. And he said, usual, how are you? What'd you do on the weekend? I said, I went to the protest for Palestine. And that started a conversation, and then he was unaware sort of the details of the conflict, sort of, was just parroting what he had heard from the mainstream media. He was a very intelligent person. He grew up in the Middle East despite being Australian. And, we had one conversation, and a few months later we were out at dinner, and he said to me, what did you think of me when we first had that conversation? And I said, look, you were ignorant, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a very factual way. You were just sort of saying what the mainstream media was saying. And he actually said, after that conversation with you, I felt bad. And time has passed, and I've done a bit of reading, and I've kind of, looked a little bit more critically at the news, and I can see now that you are absolutely right. I think what Israel is doing is becoming indefensible. My husband was just saying to me, you don't hear Zionists talking in the media very much anymore. Because it's indefensible what's happening now. They're better off just keeping quiet. And this is our opportunity to speak to our colleagues who do have humanity in them. Sami Hamdi says that the fitrah is screaming. People can see that something is wrong. And then that then needs to translate to more. So what do we do? And I think it's more than just coming out to the protest. That's just one thing. But we have local elections coming up, and we have people running on clearly sort of pro-Palestinian cards. So how will it filter through? And I guess the idea is in the long run that it will filter through picking representatives who have the same values as we do, and that's sort of more than just Palestine, obviously, but then also holding them accountable to that. There's other things that we're doing. So we have colleagues who have gone to Gaza and have come back. So do we want to position them in approach our hospitals and say, hey, I've got a friend, they've come back from Gaza. Would you like them to do a talk to the hospital? You invite in Perth recently, one of the cities in Australia, they invited an Israeli surgeon to come. So we're thinking about, okay, how about we go back to the hospital and say, hey, we've got some Australian doctors who've just come back. Would you like to have an event with them? And these are the ways that we need to do it. And unfortunately, there's a time and place for a lot of the left-wing activism that I don't know what South Africa is like, but we've had a lot of blocking ships, shutting down weapons factories. There's a place for that. Mm-hmm. There are often doctors there, and if they are not there as protesters, they're often there as support in case we need medical support in those situations. But then there's also a time and place for just, using our position as people who understand health and life and the sanctity of life to remind people of just, basic ethical principles.
So I'm going to stop you there on that very dynamic thought because we have to go to a break. But when we come back, I want to just dig a little bit deeper on your whole understanding about ethics and how that should be applied. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the second segment of Pivot on Hilaal TV with my very amazing and dynamic guest, Shazeea, Dr. Shazeea, if I may say. And before we went on to the break, Shazeea was explaining about the role of medical practitioners and healthcare workers in simply reasserting the humanity and life of individuals. And I want to take that a little further. Shazeea, you're focusing on the humanity and the dehumanization of people. And you've considered that and you're thinking about that deeply in terms of further studies that you yourself want to undertake, a postgraduate, a doctorate actually, although you're a doctor, so I think they're going to call you Dr. Shazeea. But, why they focus on humanizing and dehumanizing, and how does ethics play into all of this for you from a medical perspective?
So I've always been interested in ethics, and just really from at a basic level, it's not so much ethics as am I doing the right thing as a doctor? Is this sanctioned by Islam? What does Islam say about this? And that's really sort of the fiqh of medicine, but the fiqh is often derived from philosophical principles, and sort of the higher up you go, obviously the more abstract it starts to become. And so when I sort of finished my medical exams and finished my sort of training and became a geriatrician, it was the opportunity to look at it from a rather structured way instead of just ad hoc, reading things here and there. And so I did a master's in ethics. in bioethics, sorry, so in ethics to do with medicine and healthcare. And at the same time that I started that ethics, I actually read Jonathan Brown's book on slavery, which I think is a great read. And the really interesting thing about Jonathan Brown's writing is he's only just using slavery as a way to critique Western philosophy. And it was really nice to have that critique of Western philosophy as I was studying Western philosophy. And so I finished my master's. I really, really enjoyed it. A lot of my papers sort of used Western arguments to argue against something. So for example, I argue, purely from a Western secular perspective that smokers do not have autonomy because their decision making is impacted by addiction, by trauma, by that kind of thing. And I'm often I'm not a political, I don't have a background in political philosophy, but I often think about, Tariq Ramadan says, if France just practiced secularism or laïcité in its actual form and not have a double standard with regards to it, people would live in a lot better state than the Muslims in France do now. And it kind of gets me thinking, at least on the surface, if liberalism and secularism is neutral, and again, that's another argument, then where is the space for Muslim values in healthcare? We talk about patient values, so it's like we accept sort of individual patient values. So how can we accept Islamic values, both as the practitioner, as the healthcare worker, and the other as a patient? And if we're not accepting those values, then as you said, are we not being considered? Are we not as human as other people? And so I've been thinking about doing a doctorate for a while, and it's still sort of a work in progress. I don't know how long it'll take me to actually get it off the ground, but there's no rush in a sense that I want to get it right, and I want to have the pieces in place. But it's something that I've kept coming back to. And I think really, seeing what's happened in Gaza has been a bit of a kick in the direction, in the sense that it's like, well, actually, when push comes to shove, your own principles don't matter. Kind of talk about it a lot, but and that was a bit of a I kind of stopped myself in my tracks for a little bit and kind of had to think about, well, how do I engage with academia when they're so blatantly ignorant, or rather, as I said, they sort of choose to ignore their own principles. But after talking to a lot of people, you do kind of realize that academia as an institution might be the problem, but the people in academia are not necessarily the problem. And you actually find lots of allies within academia, as you do in healthcare and hospitals and in politics. People are just scared for, historical reasons to not say anything out, and that's sort of an institutional problem. And I didn't want to let an institutional problem, stop me from engaging with actual people who may have a lot more to say and are actually not, they don't actually dehumanize people. It says a lot, though, if the structure is dehumanizing and racist. How do we then navigate that space?
No, but I mean,
yes.
it's a very powerful approach, and I think it's a very prophetic approach, because it's about choosing ultimately to engage with the goodness, of people. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that if you see somebody, and it's mentioned even in the Quran, if there's things that you dislike, try and move away from that which you dislike and focus on the other things that you like, so in order to find a common approach. And that is such a human approach ultimately, and communication is key. I mean, in Islam also, وَجَادِلُهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ, engage with them in a way that is better. And like you said, the first encounter with one of those individuals that you met, the doctor, was where he was ignorant, but a simple engagement, an open communication opened his mind. And so we left with basically like just about 2 minutes, and I want to hear from you in conclusion. you are part of the IMA. Is the IMA adopting a strategy now to decide how to take healthcare workers, Muslim healthcare workers, forward in terms of of a voting strategy? Because Australia is going to elections soon, America is going to elections soon. We saw the British Muslims, garnered themselves around the Muslim vote. So is something like that happening in terms of your profession? And then, as an activist generally, are you encountering different organizations and groups who are now thinking strategically about how to change the way in which they choose representatives who are supposed to represent them, and are not just mouthpieces for a particular time and then change, of course, the entire strategy once they come into power?
So our organization, the Australian Islamic Medical Organization, at this stage, we're still a very new organization. And so at this stage, we're sort of sticking to the bread and butter of what medical activism looks like, and sort of not staying into politics in terms of suggesting to people whom they should vote for. I should say that we, not one of our members as far as I'm aware, but there is a doctor in Sydney who is a GP who will be running in the elections as an independent in a very large, a suburb with lots of Muslims, and against a politician who is pro-Palestinian but has just not done enough. So a lot of people have been saying amongst ourselves, "Oh, you should run, because at the end of the day, we occupy a space in society that has privilege, and we're often articulate and professional and can do that. At a community level, though, at a wider community level, so my husband is with a group called Muslim Votes Matter, which is similar to the Muslim vote in the UK, in that they're looking at seats with large Muslim populations where we can flip the seat and sort of have an impact on the next parliament. And so while I'm not directly involved, I will often hear things, or my husband will show me, "What do you think of this?" And obviously just our conversations will bounce ideas off people. I think there's still a long way to go. We're not really sure when elections are going to be called. I think they have to be called by middle of next year. And a lot will depend on, the mood will depend on what happens with the US elections. But I think when we look at the UK, we are, we're reasonably hopeful that we can definitely do something. And then, when the elections get called, the question will be, right, well, as doctors, what can we do? Are we going to go to rallies? Are we going to door knock? Are we going to use, again, that humanity, that humanitarianism, the ethics to sort of remind people of what it is that we need to vote for? But for many of us here, Gaza was a red line. And Gaza was a red line, and the targeting of the healthcare workers just was another line after that red line. And so I think that a lot of doctors will be voting against the current government.
So basically, as a parting thought in 30 seconds, would you say that, ultimately there is an obligation on us? It's no more simply, a choice. Now it's an obligation on us to do something concrete in terms in the way in which we shape decision-making, governance, etc., that will force states to be more accountable, but also force us to be more accountable in how we engage and with who we engage.
100%. I mean, I think the time for sort of being wishy-washy about, is democracy halal, this voting haram, that kind of thing, has gone. We haven't been there. We haven't been at the table, and decisions are being made in our name with our taxpayers' money, and all we can do is scream and shout, but no one's listening. Mm-hmm. So we need to put some people in there, and there will be people willing to go. So we need to back them.
Thank you so much for this very, very engaging conversation, for sharing with us a little bit about the insight of what's happening in Australia. It's very positive to see that there are minds like yourself in countries where Muslims are a minority, but where they have a formidable presence, where we, like you said, we can make a difference. So inshallah, tell your husband I'm holding my fingers crossed for him, for his organization, for you guys all in the medical profession to make an impact, because every sector that we influence is a sector that we can turn around. Thank you, Shazeea. Fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you so much for joining us, and until we meet again next week, fi amanillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.